Hey, what's up guys? Dean Hansen here. Today I'm going to be talking about photography. One of my most popular videos on YouTube is a video I made about telescopes, and I'm not really like an expert on telescopes or anything, but I had a really hard time learning how to use it. I was getting frustrated finding a bunch of different videos online, and I thought, God, it'd be easy if there was just one video that had a basic explanation of how to use a damn telescope. So I made that video, even being someone who hadn't even touched a telescope 2 weeks before I made the video, and it's my most popular video. So it just kind of goes to show that you don't have to be an expert to teach somebody something. And I'm going to kind of do the same thing with photography. I knew almost nothing about photography a few weeks ago, and I've been learning it through the photography masterclass on Udemy, which is really good. The goal of this video is to simply have a quick little crash course of how to make your photos go from looking something like this to something that looks a little bit more like this. Much like the telescope video, I'm going to start out by saying this isn't going to be easy, but it is going to be fun. It's not, using a telescope, learning photography, learning anything, most things aren't easy, So you got to go into it knowing that it's not just going to be easy. You're not going to go buy a nice camera and all of a sudden be able to take amazing pictures. Actually, if you went out and bought a nice camera, you'd probably find that the pictures you took with your phone looked a lot better because your phone is pretty good and you don't know how to use that camera to actually get a good picture out of it. I'm going to go over exposure really quick. There's a million videos on the line about exposure. I'm going to kind of cover it from a beginner's perspective. As somebody who's finally starting to understand it, I might be able to explain it a little bit better than someone who this is second nature to them. After exposure, I'm going to just talk about some tips and tricks to get pictures that look less like this and more like this. These are all the photos I'm showing you, are photos I've taken in the last few months. Alright, so let's just start with exposure. Exposure is made up of 3 different key components that you need to understand. Was I showing 4? 3 different key components that you need to understand that work differently. My God, Willow. How am I supposed to do a video with you doing that? My dogs are humping off screen. Essentially, exposure is a properly exposed photo means there's the proper amount of light in the photo. The aperture is how much light is allowed into the camera by physically closing and opening an opening in your lens. A wide aperture is a wide open opening, allowing a lot of light in. It's measured, aperture is measured in f-stops. And the lower the f-stop number, the wider, the more light, the bigger that hole is, the more light that's allowed in. Now let's contract that hole down to a much smaller aperture, and that's going to be a larger f-stop number, letting in less light. The key thing that aperture affects in your image, everything we're going to talk about affects the image differently because there's more than one way to expose an image. It's a combination of 3 things. What aperture affects is your depth of field, and that's just how much of your image can be in focus in relation to how far away it is from the lens. So a narrow depth of field would mean that you're shooting in a lower or a higher f-stop. Letting in more light is going to give you a narrow depth of field. So if I were shooting it, if this video were shot at a 1.8, my face would be in focus here, but it would be out of focus here, and the wall would be out of focus with this narrow depth of field. If I were to change that aperture up to like an f11, which I think is what I'm shooting on right now, the depth of field should be a little bit more shallow, or the depth of field should be a little bit more a wider depth of field, where my face could be in focus as well as the board behind me should both be in focus at this aperture setting. Alright, so the light gets through the set aperture of the lens, and now it's got to come into your camera. Your camera is going to have, DSLR type cameras are going to have a shutter that is blocking the light, so the light is not hitting the sensor. That shutter is only going to open up for a very brief amount of time typically, and that's called your shutter speed. The longer it's open, the more light it lets in. The faster it's open, the less time it's open, the less light that comes in. Now, shutter speed is going to be measured in fractions of a second typically, but you can go up to longer than that if you want. But a standard shutter speed might be something like 1/250th of a second. Now, what shutter speed affects is your motion blur. If the shutter is open longer, that light is being exposed to the sensor longer, and any little movement is going to show up as blur. Now, this can be kind of used in a cool way to show motion. If you want to see some blur in motion, sometimes it makes sense to lower your shutter speed and keep it open longer. And if you want a really crisp, sharp image where you want to freeze time, then you want a really fast shutter speed. Directly affects motion blur, does not affect depth of field, and aperture doesn't affect motion blur. So you can see there's two different techniques of letting in more light to the sensor that have very different effects. Now, the light has gone through the aperture of the lens. The shutter has opened for however much time you tell it to be open. Now the light is going to hit the sensor. The last thing we have to adjust is called our ISO. Now, in the old film days, ISO was the sensitivity of the film you bought. You would buy a certain ISO of film, maybe a 100 or an 800. 800 would be more sensitive to light and 100 less sensitive to light. Nowadays, with the digital world, we can change this ISO number. Most important thing to realize with ISO is there's not really a creative trade-off like you have with shutter speed or aperture. ISO pretty much just shoot in the lowest possible ISO you can and still get properly exposed, because all ISO does is we're digitally making your sensor more sensitive to light, but it's digital. And so the higher you go, the more digital noise you're going to introduce into your signal, into your picture. The higher quality the camera, typically the higher ISO you can go before you start to notice this digital noise. Most mid-range APS DSLRs can shoot up to about 3200 before you start to really notice it, but it depends on the type of shot you're shooting as well. Rule of thumb, shoot in the lowest ISO possible for the highest quality image. Alright, so now we got this basic understanding of exposure. You need to get your camera into manual mode, and you need to start changing these settings manually. You've got to get out of the auto mode on your camera if you want to start taking better pictures. So most cameras have a light meter on them that will tell you if you're over or under exposing your image, and you can kind of adjust your settings and watch that light meter. Take a shot and look at it. Before you really take your real shot, you're mainly just setting up your exposure, and you're going to be taking some shots and looking at it and seeing if you might want to underexpose or overexpose, because the meter might not be quite the exposure that you want. So the first tip that I'm going to give you that's going to hopefully get your pictures looking a lot better really quick is you've got to change your perspective. The last thing you want to do, if you can avoid it, is stand at your head height, hold the camera, and take a picture of whatever you're taking that picture of at your own head height. You've got to get down, you've got to get up, you've got to turn the camera sideways, you've got to change your perspective. Not every time do you always have to do that, but if you start doing that, your images are going to start becoming a lot more interesting and a lot more dynamic right away. And I've found that almost every picture I take where I just aim at the subject at my head height and put the subject right in the center of frame and take the picture, none of those pictures come out good. They're really basic, they're really boring. Change your perspective, get in a different spot, get uncomfortable, get down to the ground. A lot of the shots that I've found that I really like, that I've been taking of my dog, I have that camera pretty much on the ground. I am laying in the dirt, tipping the camera on its side and getting down, and those shots come out 10 times better than anything I've ever got. So that's my number one tip, is change your perspective. Number two tip is know your subject. What are you taking a picture of? Make sure that you frame and compose the image to draw attention to that subject, and in most cases you're going to want that subject in focus. So keep track of your focus. Ensure that you've got the attention drawn to the subject. Most times you're not going to want that subject right in the center of frame because that's boring. Sometimes it's not. More often than not, you want to maybe move it to the side. Change your perspective. Don't look directly at it, but still have the attention drawn to the subject. And one of the third things I want to bring up that's not really a tip is it's going to cost some money. So you could use everything that I've said in this video to take better pictures with your cell phone or with a really cheap camera. But if you're really getting into photography, you can't let like a $60 tripod throw you out of your, throw you off and make it impossible to get into the hobby. It's going to cost some money. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some practice. It's going to cost some money, just like almost every other hobby. Learning music, learning how to program, learning how to do scrapbooking, anything you can think of is going to take some time. It's going to take some money, and it's not going to be real easy. So you've got to accept those things before you buy. And the last thing is you can't just buy a really nice camera and expect to get really good photos. You really have to understand how to use it. And I promise you, if you're brand new to photography and you buy a pretty decent DSLR and you buy a pretty decent lens, you're going to be kind of upset the first time you go out because a lot of those pictures aren't going to look very good, and you're going to say, I might as well just pull out my iPhone and take a picture, and it will look better until you learn how to use it, until you start changing your perspective, until you start really learning that equipment. It's not going to look great. I used to be under the impression that I'd see an amazing photo online or on a billboard and I'd think that person just has a $3,000, $4,000 camera and they just point and shoot. And that's not the case. And a lot of times those pictures were taken with not very expensive cameras. Well, that's about everything I have to say about it. Hopefully this video helped you out, and I'll chat with you guys later.